Very warm welcome to everyone. Very appropriate since we are in the late fall. Welcome everyone to the fall 2025 edition of the Herb Lubalin Lecture Series, part of TypeCulture. Thank you for joining us for the second lecture in our series for the fall. My name is Alexander. I'm one of the instructors in the program, and I'm also the director of the Lubalin Center. Today's presentation is presented to you by Cooper Union, TypeCulture, the postgraduate certificate program in typeface design, that this lecture series is part of the curriculum, and also the Herb Lubalin Study Center, which is a hub for all sorts of typographic ephemera and collection and functions as an additional resource for the students in the program. These lectures have been part of the TypeCulture program since the program began back in 2010. So it's kind of a nice long run. There's a lot of lectures that are part of this. There are workshops as well as the two certificate programs at TypeCulture. You can find a lot of additional information here. I'm going to try to do my double duty and post as many links as I can. I also wanted to thank the TypeCulture organization for their generosity in supporting the recording and archiving of the talks that we've had. TypeCulture is an incredible resource for type information, type history. It's also a digital type foundry, but an incredible academic resource that's run by Mark Jammer. So thank you to TypeCulture for helping us record and archive these lectures. A couple of quick housekeeping notes. Feel free to use the chat. Make sure that you're toggled to everyone if you're sending a message to everyone who's watching. If you have comments for the technical crew, you can switch that to host and panelists. But if you're trying to send a message to the attendees and it's set to host and panelists, the attendees won't see it. We have a Q&A function for Q&A at the end of the talk. We'll take about 15 minutes to chat with Caroline about the lecture. Feel free to send links links. We'll post links in the chat, but feel free to send questions for Caroline through the Q&A function. If it's in the chat, they might get lost. So just make sure that you are sending it to into the right window. We will read through the questions at the end. And as I said, we'll be posting links in the chat. There's unfortunately not an easy way to save links through Zoom. So if you see things that you're interested in, make sure to click on the link and then it'll open up in a browser and you can kind of keep it and save it for reading later. The lecture is being recorded. If you have to leave for one reason or another, you can catch the recording. Hopefully you can stay through to the very end and stay for the Q&A. But if you wanted to catch the recording, it will be archived in a week or so on Vimeo. But the YouTube link that is at the top right corner of the Zoom window will take you to YouTube, and you can keep that window open if you wanted to catch that in a few minutes or later in the day. We do have one other lecture coming up, which will be the third and fourth technically lectures in the series. We always have four. On December 8th, we will have a lecture called Roman de Roi, 330 years later, according to various accounts. The work on the cutting of the first size of Roman de Roi, the King's Roman, began about 330 years ago. So it's kind of a good moment to look back at the history of that. The talk, the two lectures side by side by Dr. Ricardo Oloco and Sarah Grandin will provide the audience and us included the wider context of this large-scale typeface design project. It's pretty impressive to make project for the royal use. They'll talk about the technical process of making of the punches, but also highlight the complex relationship between the various stakeholders of that project and the artisans involved in cutting of those letter forms. So that's a lecture that's going to be at the same time on December 8th, which is also the Monday, and that will close the fall lecture series. If you would like to register for that, There's a link in the chat for a direct way to get to Eventbrite and register for that talk. We have all the links in coopertype.org/lectures. Which is also where the recordings live. If you missed the talk we had a couple of weeks ago with David Quay, I Type Tourist City Signs, a wonderful, very, very visual presentation with a lot of context around the idea of type sort of in the physical landscape. If you missed that lecture, you can find a recording of that by going to these two locations, vimeo.com, CooperType, or you can go to the main lecture hub, find the lecture slightly lower below the fold, click on that, and the video is embedded into the post for David's lecture for that. Or you can go to Vimeo and check out all the other lectures we have there. We have I think nearly 80 lectures archived there, so it's a pretty significant amount of content. So and let me post that so it's easier for folks to find. Add that to the chat. There we go. And then it is my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Caroline Archer-Parré. I'm very glad that Caroline is here to talk about Baskerville and the work of Baskerville around the punches. In Baskerville, it's also a really important date for that. Caroline is a professor of typography and co-director of the Center for Printing History and Culture at Birmingham City University, University of Birmingham in the UK. She's also the chair of the Baskerville Society. She is the co-investigator on a 3-year funded project with University of Cambridge, which was titled Small Performances Investigating the Typographic Punches of John Baskerville through Heritage, Science, and Practice-Based Research. It's something you will learn more about shortly. Caroline has an interest in typographic history that spans 18th to the 20th centuries. She has published widely, including authoring and co-editing several books. It is my absolute pleasure to have Caroline here to present a story of Baskerville and more. I will pass the stage to Caroline. Thank you so much for being here and presenting, Caroline.
Thank you, Sasha, and thank you so much for inviting me. It's going to be a real, I hope, pleasure and privilege to do so. I didn't know who to expect as my audience. I thought about 30 students were going to turn up, but I've seen all the messages coming in the chat, and I can see you're coming from all over the world. So that's a wonderful thing. And thank you for all of you for attending. Now, I'm going to try and attempt to share my screen. There we go. So this talk is going to look at John Baskerville, famous 18th century English printer, publisher, type founder, and designer, of course, of the Baskerville typeface, a version of which we have available today on billions of computers worldwide, more than 270 years after it was first created. So in this talk, I'm going to introduce you to the man. I'm going to take a brief look at some of his books that he created, typeface he designed, and the social and cultural significance behind that typeface. I'm also going to touch on the 3-year project that Sasha has already alluded to, between the University of Cambridge and us in Birmingham, where we're very specifically looking at the Baskerville punches. You may wonder why I've called this talk Small Performances. It's actually a phrase that Baskerville used himself to describe the books that he produced. And we just rather like the phrase, so we keep talking about small performances. But before I launch into the lecture, I'm just going to show you this image. I actually live in Truro, which is a very small town right in the far southwest of England. Go any further and you fall into the Atlantic after that. But strangely enough, in Truro, we have a coffee shop called the Cooper Union. So I thought this would be the most appropriate place for me to go and write this talk and channel Cooper Union through me. So hopefully that was paid off. So let's start off by looking at the man. So here he is, John Baskerville, born 1707, died 1775. This this oil painting that we have of him is the only contemporaneous image that we have of him. It was painted 12, 16 months before he died. So this is Baskerville as an older man at the end of his career. Whilst we have his portrait, so we know what he looks like, we don't really have very much by way of documentation that we can start to build a biography of Baskerville's life. Biographies have been attempted before, but they're quite patchy because the documentation is patchy and we have big gaps in our knowledge and understanding of Baskerville's life. But what I can tell you is he's a writing master, carver of gravestones, a japanner, a type founder, a printer, a publisher, an industrialist. He was a free thinker. He was a deist and I think very much overlooked figure of the Industrial Enlightenment. Fun fact about Baskerville, if you remember nothing else of this lecture, I can guarantee this is the one thing you will take away with you. Baskerville is allegedly the world's most moved corpse. He has been moved on 8 occasions since he died and buried 3 times. It is a fantastic story. His post-mortem life is a wonderful story, but that is really for another talk, and I get a little bit ahead of myself here anyway. We know very little about Baskerville's childhood or his schooling, except he was born in 1707 in the Worcestershire village of Wolverley, which is in the English Midlands. He was the 9th child of an illiterate farmer. We know his father was illiterate because in the parish records he simply signs his name with an X, and I find it fascinating that the creator of one of the world's most influential typefaces was the son of an illiterate farmer. It's a vast chasm for Baskerville to stride. Baskerville was brought up in the village inn, which also doubled as the local bawdy house, which was frequently raided by the constabulary. So there's a slightly colourful childhood behind him. That he went to school, we can be certain because he could read and write, but we don't know anything about his schooling or what teacher gave him the love of letters that he talks about. But certainly his education provided him with a motivation to be more than an agrarian innkeeping farmer like his father. And so he left Wolverley. And in 1726, maybe 1728, we're not altogether sure, he moved to the large and flourishing town of Birmingham, which was about 20 miles east of Wolverley. And he then lived and worked in Birmingham for the remainder of his life. So Baskerville's something of a polymath. He had his fingers in many pies. As I mentioned earlier, initially worked as a writing master, and you can see an example of his handwriting on the left. That's a copy of one of the pages from his last will and testament. The handwriting again is the handwriting of an old man. But the flourishes and the fancy D's and the curves are very much what we see in Baskerville's handwriting throughout his life. And he carved letters for gravestones, and you can see in the middle of the panel here a piece of slate, which is now in the Library of Birmingham, which is the only extant evidence that we have as Baskerville, a stone carver, and as he says at the bottom, a writing master. You can see at this point he's not spelling his name with the E on the end. The spelling of his name does change. In 1742, he was granted a patent for the manufacturing of Japanware. You may not know what Japanware was, but it was incredibly fashionable in the 18th century. Japanware was an imitation of Asian lacquer work on tin or papier-mâché, on which images were painted, gilded, and made into household goods such as tea trays and snuff boxes. Baskerville's fashionable Japanware was exported to clients across the globe, and he made an absolute fortune from this. There are no extant examples of his work, or no known examples of his work. Japan has never signed their products, so it's quite difficult to know what's his work and what's somebody else's. So the little example that you have here is of an 18th century French piece of Japanware. In 1750, aged 44, Baskerville's wealth enabled him to return to his first interest, which was the creation of letters. He didn't go back to handwriting or letter carving. That wasn't going to make him very much money, and Baskerville, I have to say, was motivated by money. This time he applied his love of letters to the great technology of the day, which was printing. Baskerville was certainly a technocrat. I think if he came back today, he wouldn't be looking at letterpress. He'd be wanting to see what all the digital stuff can do. But he used the technology of the 18th century to design a typeface that made Birmingham a town without typographic equal, and which certainly changed the course of type design. He's known as the complete printer because he understood that for his typeface to print to its best advantage, then all aspects of 18th century printing technology needed refining. So Baskerville not only created one of the world's most historically important typefaces, he cast his own type. He improved the construction of the printing press. He developed a new kind of paper which was smoother rather than the customary bumpy laid paper of the time. He refined the quality of the printing inks that he was working with, and he took a new approach to the production of end papers. So his typographic experiments certainly put him ahead of his time. They had an international impact and did much to enhance the printing and publishing industries of the day. One important fact to realize about Baskerville is he was an amateur. He never served an apprenticeship. He never received any training as a printer or a type founder. He was completely self-taught in all aspects of the printing process, which, to my mind, makes his achievements even more remarkable. So that was a very brief introduction to Baskerville, the man. I'm just going to now give you an equally brief introduction to the books that he printed. So whilst we have little documentation of Baskerville's life, we do have many, many examples of his printed outputs, which are of course are available in libraries and private collections from around the world. He printed more than 50 volumes in Birmingham between 1757 and 1774, which are recognised as by printing historians, librarians, and bibliophiles as masterpieces of the art of bookmaking. The historian Thomas Macaulay wrote that Baskerville's books went forth to astonish all the librarians of Europe. And Baskerville himself stated, "It's not my desire to print many books, but only such as are books of consequence, of intrinsic merit, or established reputation." And in fulfillment of that, he commenced by printing an edition of Virgil's poetry in 1757. That was his first book. And continued with established authors of the English canon, such as Milton, Addison, and Congreve. And And his aim was to produce books which the public may be pleased to see in an elegant dress and to purchase at such a price as will repay the extraordinary care and expense that must necessarily be bestowed upon them. In 1758, the University of Cambridge elected Baskerville as its printer, where he realized his ambition to print an octavo Book of Common Prayer in 1760, of which he produced about 8 different versions, and a folio Bible, which you can see bottom right here, in 1763, which is still regarded as one of the world's most beautifully printed books. But whilst Baskerville's books were well received in Europe and America, at home he suffered the disapprobation of the British printing and publishing trades, which really regarded him as an amateur and a provincial to boot, and he didn't have a university education. He was beating them at their own game, so of course he was ruffling feathers at home. But such negativity temporarily prompted him to give up printing. But he returned to his press in 1769 when he issued in Birmingham a Bible in parts and a series of classical volumes, including works by Terence, Horace, Ariosto, and the one that you can see here by Florus. He concluded his output with William Hunter's magisterial The Anatomy of the Human Gravid Uterus. It's the largest format of all his books and included 34 copperplate engravings, which really revolutionized the study of the pregnant body. If you ever get to see it, it is a magnificent piece of printing, and the engravings are absolutely stunning. And of course, all his books are printed using his own typeface. Baskerville tells us what he was trying to achieve when he designed his type. He created a sort of manifesto, which he printed in the preface to his printing of Milton's Paradise Lost. And in this preface, Baskerville tells us, amongst the several mechanical arts that have engaged my attention, there is no one which I have pursued with so much steadiness and pleasure as that of type founding. Having been an early admirer of the beauty of letters, I became insensibly desirous of contributing to the perfection of them. I formed to myself ideas of greater accuracy than have yet appeared, and have endeavoured to produce a set of types according to what I conceive to be their true proportion. He goes on to say, Mr. Caslon is an artist to whom the Republic of Learning has great obligations. His ingenuity has left a fairer copy from my emulation than any other master. In his great variety of character, I intend not to follow him. The Roman and the italic are all I have hitherto attempted. So unlike Caslon, Bodoni, or virtually any other type founder, Baskerville only ever created one typeface, not multiple typefaces. Baskerville was really creating his typeface not for sale, but for his own use. He didn't have the need to create multiple typefaces on a commercial basis. And as you can see here, we have 14 sizes of Roman and italic. And Baskerville, as a typeface, with its well-considered design and elegant proportions, its methods of thickening and thinning parts of the letter, and its sharp and horizontal treatments of serifs, remains one of the world's most widely used, enduring, and influential typefaces. It was greatly admired by contemporaries, including Benjamin Franklin in America, Giambattista Bodoni in Italy, and Voltaire in France. As typographers and typographic historians, we are understandably concerned with the appearance of the type. But the characters on the page are simply the result of a cumulative process, which owes as much to science and technology as it does to aesthetics. And so for today's talk, I'm not going to discuss the look of the typeface so much, and nor the marks on the paper that the type leaves. But what I'm interested in this talk is the history of the punches, the biography of the punches, if you like, and the social, cultural, and political significance of the letters that Baskerville created. That's what I'm going to be concentrating on. But first of all, I'm guessing some of you will know this, for others, this may be a new bit of information. I'm going to just briefly walk you through creating type in the 18th century. So, first of all, Baskerville would have drawn his characters in 2 dimension on paper. He then had to translate his 2-dimensional designs into 3-dimensional metal type, and this was a 3-stage process. The first stage was punch cutting, and that was done by taking short lengths of steel on which his letters were cut in reverse and in relief on one end. The punch then had to be subject to tempering. It's a process of heat treating, which increased the toughness and reduced the brittleness of the punch and enabled its use as a tool. Because that's what a punch is, it's a tool. After tempering, the punch was struck with a hammer into the surface of a soft metal, such as copper. And that left an impression of a right reading character to be cast. And that was called the matrix. Baskerville's type was manufactured when the matrix was passed to the typecaster, who inserted it into a mould. The typecaster then took a ladle of molten type metal, which is an amalgam of tin, antimony, and lead, and poured it into a funnel at the top of the mould. And this produced the cast of the type in relief and in reverse. The typecaster could make as many copies of Baskerville's type as was needed to compose his volumes. The type was then distributed into wooden cases for the compositor to set the text required for Baskerville's books. When the type's printed on the page, of course, it's right reading and it's back to being 2-dimensional again. So 18th century type making is this constant switching between 2D, 3D, back to 2D, of right reading, wrong reading to right reading. The research project that I'm involved in is particularly interested in the first stage of the process, which is the creation of the punches. Punches are the tools that Baskerville had to make in order to create his type. And as such, they can be seen as the template for his printing types. We have but we're not quite sure, but just over 3,000 punches, Baskerville punches, are now located in the historical printing room at the University of Cambridge. And they are the subject of a 3-year research project of which we are in the midst at the moment. And we're aiming to do many things with that project. One of the things we need to do is clarify the corpus. We need to work out exactly what is in that collection. We're aware not all the punches are Baskerville's punches. That is, they were not all made by him in Birmingham. Some are later additions. So we're having to clarify the corpus. They are stored in such a way that there's some rust on some of them, so we need to stop the cross-contamination happening. So we're looking at ways of conserving and rehousing that collection. But in terms of research, the big thing we're trying to do is try and disentangle the craft to understand Baskerville's particular methods of working. And to do this, we have a team which is made up of archaeologists, metallurgists, jewelers, blacksmiths, engravers, rare book specialists, conservation specialists, heritage scientists, and of course printing historians, all applying their collective and specialist perspectives to bear on the project. So here's some of the larger sizes of punches which are sitting in wooden boxes. This is how they arrived in Cambridge in the 1950s. The boxes in which they sit are not contemporaneous, they're not 18th century. I think they are 20th century boxes, and the punches are organized pretty much by size, not quite alphabetically, but certainly by size. When I first saw the punches, which is many years ago now, and they lifted the lid of the boxes in which they sat, I had a bit of a kind of Tutankhamun, Howard Carter moment. And I was generally moved when I saw these wonderful things, these very beautiful things sitting in their boxes. And I wanted to try and get the punchers to talk to us because they are sitting there as silent witnesses to 270 years of history. And I wanted to know what it was that they had to tell us. I knew I couldn't answer all the questions I wanted to of these punches because I'm not a metallurgist, I'm a printing historian. Hence the great interdisciplinarity of this project. And one of the things I need to do is bring together all the research from all these disciplines to make it a coherent story. And we hummed and hawed over how this could be done. And one thing we've landed on is the creation of an object biography of the punches. And that's what I'm going to aim to share with you this afternoon. So the first thing I tried to do was create a timeline of these punches. Where were they? At what date? Who owned them? Who handled them in the workshop? What were they used for at any given point? But I then found it was a really, really complicated story and a complicated timeline that these punches had been through. So I started to put together a table just so it would sort out the information in my own mind. The problem with the table is it's linear and it doesn't allow for the multiple transitions and transactions that the punches have been involved in. It also suggests that there's a beginning and an end to the story, that it's a tale, if you like, of birth, life, and death of the punches. And that's not quite right. But on the other hand, the table highlighted the need to consider the many spaces and locations in which the punches found themselves, and how this related to the time in which they were existing and the influence of the people with whom they interacted. The punches have moved around a lot, and in doing so, they keep being recontextualized. They've assumed different identities according to what locations they've been in, and they've undergone many transformations, both physically and how we perceive them. They've lived through many different regimes in different countries, and that too has had an impact on how the typeface has developed. So we started to feel that to understand the punches, we can ask the same sort of questions we would for a human biography. Where did they come from? What are their origins? Who created them? How were they made? Where did they live and in what conditions? What did they do? For what purpose and what effect? I also think it's been long accepted that art has power of agency. To my mind, the punches are works of art, and have they exerted agency over those they've encountered? Are the punches more than simply tools? Do they have the power to act and influence human and cultural values? This is a very anthropomorphic approach to the punches, but I don't think it's unwarranted. As typographers, we describe typefaces in very human terms. Typefaces, of course, have a face, which has parts, which we call eyes and ears. Type has an anatomy. We refer to letters as characters. each with their own personality. Collectively, the characters form families, and we give those families names. So I think typographic vocabulary has already given type human qualities. It's a logical step for me, therefore, to approach the story of the punches from the perspective of biography. So here's 250 years story condensed into probably 15 minutes. So a real whistle-stop tour of the highlights. Starting in 1750, John Baskerville took 5 years to create his family of types, and they were made here in Birmingham at his home in Easy Hill. There is some debate on whether Baskerville cut the punches himself or whether he employed somebody to do that for him. However, in his letters, he does complain of ruining his eyesight through the daily necessity of working with microscopes. And of all the trades in which he was involved, punch cutting was the only one that required microscopes. So I'm fairly certain that Baskerville did do punch cutting, but he was not alone in doing this. Birmingham at the time had many, many engravers working in trades such as glass, ceramics, and it was not difficult for Baskerville to find capable craftsmen within the town who could transfer their skills of engraving from glass or silverware, bringing that into the cutting of punches. And he found one such engraver called John Handy. And John Handy spent the rest of the next 20 years working with John Baskerville, adjusting and tinkering with these punches, because Baskerville wanted his typographic family to be made with greater accuracy than had yet appeared. And we're starting to see in the project, when we compare the punches with the printed page, there is variation. So the crossbar of the A and the punch could be in one position, but the crossbar on the printed page is lower. We cannot put that down to ink spread. That is simply because there was another punch. So we're starting to gather evidence of this continual process of alterations that Baskerville went through with his punches. But this continual process of alteration means there is no definitive Baskerville. It's not a fixed typeface, it never was. And it's not unchanging like other typefaces are. It also raises the question, if Baskerville is continually altering his typeface, at what point can we say this is an original Baskerville? I don't think we can. We can't say that. But the one thing we can say about the punches is they were a highly valued tool with a single job, which was the reproduction of themselves. And those tools were handled by other people beyond the workshop. There were many visitors to Baskerville's workshop because 18th century Birmingham was then a very rapidly expanding and industrialized town. And both the town and Baskerville's workshops became sites of industrial tourism. People came from all over the country and from all over Europe to look at the various manufacturers and manufacturing techniques within the town. And the punches were part of that tourist trail that people went on. So at this point, the punches start to take on an additional identity. They're not simply tools, they're a tourist attraction, they're a curiosity as a site of manufacturing interest. Baskerville, the father of the family, dies in 1775, and in 1779, Sarah, Baskerville's widow, puts the punches up for sale. At this point, Caroline de Beaumarchais, French poet, politician, publisher, gunrunner, author of Marriage of Figaro, steps in and purchases the punches. And at that point, their life takes an unexpected turn as they emigrate to France via Germany. During the purchase process, Beaumarchais used the punches as a blind to cover messages of political importance between himself and Lord Shelburne, who was then Secretary of State in Britain. It was this kind of James Bond Ian Fleming-esque saga where letters passed between the two men using invisible ink, which could only be seen when heated. So you have this cover of a letter where they're talking about the punches, but underneath the letter talking about the punches, you have all their political conversation going on. So at this point, the punches take on yet another identity. They are political tools at this point, and not for the last time either. When they left Birmingham, Baskerville's punches went first to live at Beaumarchais' printing and publishing house at Fort Kiel in Germany, just across the Rhine on the opposite side from Strasbourg. The little image in the middle here, you can see Strasbourg is where you have the church, Fort Kiel is the other side of the river. Unfortunately, in Kiel, they were handled by a whole host of people who really didn't understand the needs and sensitivities of typographic punches. Here they were put to work making the type, which was used to print, quite badly by the way, the whole of the banned works of Voltaire. Typographically, this was not to be their finest hour. But the printing was significant as it involved the Baskerville family in an act of defiance against the French government, which had prohibited the printing of Voltaire in France. Coincidentally, Baskerville and Voltaire had actually been friends and correspondents, and Baskerville was known as Birmingham's little Voltaire. So I think he would have approved of the idea of Voltaire having his work printed using his type, but he would certainly have disapproved of the typographic quality. The punches were also used to produce other defiant literature, such as America Libera by the Italian poet Vittorio Alfieri, which was in praise of the American Revolution. During the time at Kiel, the punches were adapted and added to. Some of the punches were given a French makeover and began to wear French clothes, if you like. The French didn't like the capital Q, the capital J, the figures 3 and 5, and various other characters. So they changed them. With the addition of French diacritical characters into the set, they start to speak literally with a French accent. And so, if you like, a French branch of the family emerges and their typographic DNA starts to change. But in Kiel, the punches also experienced tragedy. Beaumarchais' financial troubles meant all the punches were taken as indemnity by a Strasbourg banker who demanded money in exchange for the return of the punches. They evidently knew their value. He kept the punches for 12 months, after which they were transported back to Kiel, only to become victims of a road traffic accident as their carriage upturned in icy conditions, and more than 300 of the punches were lost at that point. In 1790, the printing of Voltaire was complete, and Beaumarchais moved the Baskerville punches to Paris. I have to say the timing was not great. They took up residence in Beaumarchais' warehouse, which overlooked the Bastille, which had just been stormed. The French Revolution was in full swing, and there was chaos in Paris. Initially, the keeper of the seals denied the punches entry into the city. They were foreigners without the right paperwork, and they made the authorities suspicious. Beaumarchais intervenes, telling the mayor of Paris, the punches are typographic riches, so precious a kind and unique beauty. They are the kind of property which is no one's concern, the destruction of which will bring irreparable harm to the whole art of typography. So they were released. One reason the family was moved to Paris was so Beaumarchais could take advantage of the new opportunities in printing in the wake of the Revolution. Baskerville was used to print Le Monde, which is the paper of the Revolution, and various other radical publications. A copy of the newspaper is here, and I have put a cutout which says, printed using the characters of Baskerville. So important was it the revolutionaries, and so much political significance had they invested in Baskerville as a typeface. They felt the need to announce this on every issue of the paper. Although I've yet to verify this, the Constitutional Act, which followed the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, was printed by the Society of Jacobins in 1793, also using Baskerville's typeface, as was an address issued by the National Convention in the same year. And so starting to question, can we see Baskerville as the thinking radical's typeface of choice? The face of the revolution, perhaps. More work needs to be done on it, but the evidence is building up. By the end of the second decade of the 19th century, the Punch's radical career ended, and the family spent 100 years living below the typographic radar, moving from one Parisian type foundry to another, forgotten, anonymous, hidden from view. No one realized anymore who they were. That is until 1917, when they were discovered, or rediscovered by the American typographer Bruce Rogers, who at the time was typographical advisor to Cambridge University Press. I like to think this discovery makes them a horde, the Baskerville horde, perhaps. Once they had been unmasked, the family was put to work again and used to make the matrices and type, which were then used for publications in France. And it was the start of the Baskerville revival. By 1936, the Punches were in the hands of Parisian type founders Debeney and Penniel. In 1952, after long negotiations, the Punches were repatriated back to Britain to be archived in the historical printing room at the University of Cambridge. It was a move which yet again changes our perceptions of the Punches and how we interact with them. At this stage, they're no longer tools, but precious historical artifacts to be handled with gloves. They've transitioned from tools in a dirty, inky printing environment to humidity-controlled environment as jewels in an archive. Their repatriation back to Britain was coloured by post-war politics, which seemed to drag the Punches wherever they go. After the war, there was quite a lot of anti-British sentiment, which very strong in France. But whilst the Punches were definitely casualties of post-war politics, they were also vehicles for repairing relations between England and France, which had hampered the negotiations. In France, the return of the Punches to England was covered by Le Monde and Le Figaro, and in Britain by the Times and the BBC, who went in and filmed the return of the Punches to Cambridge. And local news outlets across Britain also covered the story. The French ambassador to London handed the Punches to the university at an event in Cambridge. You can see that in the image on the right here. They were very much a symbol of entente cordiale between the two nations. And the British typographic elite held a dinner at Kettner's restaurant in honour of the Punches. You can just about see Beatrice Ward. And the image on the left, you can see Beatrice Ward, and the table on the right just looking at the camera there. Some members of the family were almost immediately recalled back to Paris, where Debeney and Penniel put them to work striking matrices and casting new type. This was done specifically for the printing office at Harvard University, where at least 7 books were printed using recast Baskerville from the original. Astonishingly, I think, the Punches were effectively given diplomatic immunity and they travelled between France and England in bags of the embassy staff. And whilst some of the punchers were back in Paris, others undertook a road trip around the UK, performing at various events, including the landmark exhibition Printing in the Mind of Man, which was held at the British Museum and Earl's Court in 1963. The punchers at this stage take on another persona. They have become celebrities, and not just within the typographic world, but with the wider public as well. And then all of us who are currently involved in the Small Performances project are also now indelibly part of the Baskerville family history, as we're reshaping perceptions and changing people's understanding of the punches. For the archaeologists involved in the project, the punchers have become lab volunteers who have offered their bodies to be weighed, measured, prodded, x-rayed, and even dissected for analysis, all for the advancement of typographic scientists. The jewelers have been reading the lines, the wrinkles, the dents, and the bulges on the bodies for evidence of their birth and later use. The heritage scientists are recording them photographically for scientific interpretation by the whole team. And strangely, the punchers have also become a muse as they model and pose for camera, and the photographers are creating art out of art through their fantastic images. And in doing so, they make us see and think about the punches in a totally different way. The typeface designers amongst us, Ricardo Aloco, who's coming to speak to you next week, and Michael Patenay, are using the punches for what they were intended. That is the production of type for print, as they're now designing an open source type for the digital domain, which will come out of the project. So that's the drama of the punches. There are, of course, many more scenes, more dramatist personae, more entrances and exits, more voices off than I can possibly describe here. And I've told the story of the punches as a drama to show how perhaps we can view the punches through the lens of object biography, to highlight the temporal, the spatial, the relational, the agential characteristics of the punches. But as I mentioned at the start, biographers tend to be linear and limited, and like a human life, suggest a beginning, a middle, and an end. But where does the life of the punch start? Where does the telling of the story of the punches begin? The two are not necessarily the same. When did the punches come to life? When does any life begin? At the point of conception, at the moment of birth, at some point in between, or perhaps it goes further back to the proverbial twinkle in the eye. Materially, do we take the biography back to the mining and the merging of their various metal elements? Or do we begin in the forge where the bar was created? Certainly the life of the punches started before they entered Baskerville's workshop. And one aspect of the project is trying to determine where that metal came from. How old is that metal? Where was it mined? Conceptually, too, the story goes back further with an investigation of typographic influences and the inspiration of handwriting on Baskerville's type. We also need to look at the external influences on Baskerville himself and the stimuli of Birmingham's industrial enlightenment and the milieu which contributed to the production of the punches. And where does the story end? We know the punchers are still alive and well and living in Cambridge. How far do we extend the story beyond the punchers? How far forward or even sideways? As early as 1768, the Fry Type Foundry in Bristol in the UK was issuing a typeface in very, very close imitation of Baskerville. It's often quite difficult to tell the two apart. There have been at least two typefaces in the 18th century, both erroneously claiming to be Baskerville, pretenders to the Birmingham throne. And since the 1920s, there have been a whole range of typefaces produced for various technologies: hot metal, photo setting, computer setting, desktop publishing, digital, which have all taken their inspiration and name from the original Baskerville. I see these as cousins of Baskerville family, once, twice, three times, four times removed, maybe, but all still related to the original. These imitators have transformed the Baskerville typeface, whilst at the same time remained connected to the past. But I do wonder how inalienable Baskerville's connection with these new faces is, because some, such as the Microsoft version, has drifted significantly from the original, whatever point we decide that original is. Certainly, the Baskerville typeface has been recreated for a globalized market, and now anyone can interact with the typeface and modify it themselves at the click of a button. Contemporary Baskerville is not separated by a temporal break between past and present. Instead, it's a continuation of the way type works in concert with other things, with humans, with technology. And I think these typefaces should be included in any biography that we write. An afterthought. The biography of the Punches can be collective. I can write a biography of the Punches as a whole family, but also individual, a history of specific characters within that family. As I mentioned earlier, punches are unusual tools. A 20-point capital Q punch can only result in a 20-point capital Q printed character. You can't make it larger, you can't make it smaller, you can't turn it into another character altogether. Therefore, in theory, you can identify which punch resulted in which character on a printed page. And this is very different from, say, a hammer or a spanner, which produces many different unrelated items, and it's not possible to marry a given hammer or a given spanner to a particular artifact. Punches are unusual in that sense. And whilst the project aims to be able to marry printed examples of Baskerville's characters to the punches in our care, another approach is to take the sample forward and map the changes in design of specific characters across technological transformations. And we've just started to do that. We have a new research associate who uses something called geometric morphometrics, whereby she can trace the outline of things and then compare those outlines to many other examples of the same thing. And we can map the changes by doing that. So the story of the Baskerville Punches has no real beginning other than where we choose, and no end, since the punches and their extensions continue to move.
Thank you so much, Caroline. A really great insight, a lot of really interesting information. I want to encourage folks to send in questions if you have them. We'd love to kind of converse. But again, thank you so much for so much content, so much intriguing avenues of questioning or kind of I don't know. I definitely like have interesting ideas and interesting questions that sort of that are kind of percolated for me. I was curious when you were talking about the sort of the repatriation of the type back to the UK. I mean, I presume the answer is quite obvious, but the material went to Cambridge. Curious, why not Birmingham? Is it just obviously the prestige and reputation and the political might that Cambridge wields?
Well, This is a sore point. Of course, Birmingham Steels, we should have the punches. They were made in Birmingham after all. But it was Bruce Rogers who was at Cambridge at the time who initiated the conversations, and they went to Cambridge. They're not going to come, they're not going to surrender them to Birmingham now. Um, so that's where they are, and they're being looked after, and they've been there since 1953. And this is really the first time that any extensive research has been done on those things. So yeah, that's why they came to Cambridge.
The other thing I was curious, like there's this incredible anecdote. I mean, I'm sure it's more than an anecdote, but the relationship to Ben Franklin. It seemed like Baskerville and Franklin corresponded quite often, or often enough. I mean, I think Franklin corresponded with lots of type um, punch cutters, type foundries across Europe, I think for his personal reasons. But there's this, um, I imagine, a well-known anecdote about Franklin using the criticism of Baskerville, which was quite common, I guess, at the time, kind of disproving the I guess the false line of reasoning that Baskerville's types were hard to read or kind of hard on the eye. I don't know if there's more context around that.
No, exactly. I mean, we have those letters from Franklin to Baskerville. Franklin, from the beginning, was a very good supporter of Baskerville. He purchased Baskerville's volumes, and he would buy multiple copies of Baskerville's volumes. For those who don't know the story, um, uh, people would accuse Baskerville in the 18th century of his typefaces would make people go blind because of for the 18th century eye, the high contrast between the thick and the thin strokes. And back in the US, Franklin had a friend who was very vociferous on this point. And so what Franklin did is he took a specimen from Baskerville, tore off the top, so Baskerville's name was, no, sorry, took a specimen from Caslon, tore off Caslon's name from the top, gave it to his friend, and asked his friend to point out all the faults with this typeface, which his friend very comfortably and willingly did, only to be told afterwards, well, this is Caslon, the typeface that you've been praising all this time, not Baskerville.
The other figure I'm always curious about is Sarah Eves and the relationship. Kind of certainly in the sale, right? Like I think probably the main reason that the punches ended up in France is through Sarah, but also like if there's more research that is being done, kind of as part of this project, kind of the looking into the role that Sarah played. I mean, I think I think just the such a remarkably well-established individual with I think somewhat radical views for his time or sort of beliefs and relationship to Sarah. Like I think that just seems like to make Baskerville like an incredibly fascinating figure, quite different from other folks. I'm curious.
I mean, we are trying to do some work on Sarah. Um, there is very little of a John Baskerville archive. There is zero of a Sarah Baskerville archive. But we are pulling at threads and trying to knit these threads together to make a story around her. Um, she is a fascinating character. I think she was a very, very strong woman. She had been abandoned by her husband. She was left with four children. Baskerville took her under his wing. She became his housekeeper. They very, very quickly became lovers. She lived with him for 15 years, unmarried to him, while she was married to someone else. This is not what you normally do in the 18th century. Um, After Baskerville's death, we do have reports of people visiting, and she would very capably show them around the type foundry and the printing works and was very knowledgeable. So from little snippets like this, I think she certainly had more of a typographic understanding than we might imagine that she had. And she had more involvement in the running of the business. She really knew what she was trying to sell as well. She wasn't just trying to get rid of her deceased husband's stuff. She knew these things had a value.
Yeah. There's a few questions that I think came in while we were chatting. I want to see if there's anything. There's a question comment from Jerry Kelly. Hi, Jerry. Good to see you. Or virtually, I guess. Jerry's comment, I believe Bruce Rogers rediscovered the punches, but John Dreyfus was the one who worked on repatriating them to England after the war, and Dreyfus was typographic advisor to Cambridge. Therefore, they wound up there. Also, Cambridge already had a collection of historically important punches, Kelmscott and a Dove's type. Yes, it's a really good kind of.
I mean, John Dreyfus did a lot of work on the punches. He was the first person who started to try and map the movement of the punches. Um, he he did the research behind it, and I think John's research was actually hampered quite badly because again, we're in immediate post-war. The imprimerie, sorry, the Bibliothèque Nationale was very anti-Semitic. You go in with a name like Dreyfus, that's not going to help you greatly. So he employed two women who were based in France who did all the fundamental searching of the archives for him. Um, Desmond Flower was another person who was involved in the negotiations rather than the research behind. But yeah, I have a lot to thank John Dreyfus for.
Mhm.
uh, and we have a fantastic archive of Dreyfus's papers in the University Library in Cambridge, which details a lot of the work that he was doing. And it's been a great privilege to step in his footsteps and follow through his paperwork.
Mhm. And I think also like curious, as you presenting the the this idea, and this is kind of relating to this clarifying question in terms of the distinction on the slide that you had a lot of the type specimen, the pretender versus inspired. Maybe you could clarify a little bit. The pretenders were the typefaces that were kind of being passed off as being
Yeah,
original to
exactly.
Baskerville.
Exactly. So you have Fry in Bristol who very quickly produced a typeface which is in very close proximity to the original Baskerville. And if you see it on a printed page, it's quite often difficult to determine which is the original and which is Fry's. So they're the impersonators, they're the imitators. Um, there is also because the punches have a dispersed history. You know, they're going to Kiel, they're going to Paris, they're going here, they're going everywhere. Some get lost. There was a French type foundry called Laveau, I think it was, and they have always claimed that the punches that they have are the genuine Baskerville punches. If you see printed type specimens, you would know that they're not,
Mm.
except there are two or three characters within that specimen where you think, oh, that is actually very close. So maybe some continuation project, we will start to look at the false claimants and the imitators. Um, and then we get all the 20th century versions of Baskerville who are inspired by some to a great degree, some like Microsoft, which has drifted considerably from the original.
Mhm. And the De Berny Pinault version is also like a revival, right? It's not, they didn't have access to the punches except for the stuff that they made for Harvard. Is that correct? So like the.
So they had after they gave them back to England, a lot of them went back to France again because they wanted this program of striking new matrices so they could then cast the type for Harvard.
Hmm. Yeah, because
And
there's a few catalogs that I've seen Baskerville show up, and I always just assume that it's like a revival, like an ATF or another, but they did
no,
have a closer source.
no, they went to the source to produce that. Yeah.
Hmm. Which is interesting that it's like, it's quite a while later. There's a type on the market that has a closer link published in another country altogether. And I've heard that story about the De Bernie Pinot being a more faithful, more authentic cast of Baskerville, much more than any other competitive revival, because it was like I heard it as like they had the punches, which seems strange, but if it does make sense now in kind of in the way that you explained it.
And so we will deploy this geometric morphometrics onto the Debani version and just see how close it has kept to whatever is Baskerville's original. Let's say he was constantly for 20 years tinkering with that typeface, and you can't see the differences with the naked eye, except there are some characters which have he does an alternate Q, for example. But so many of the differences are just so small that as a reader you won't see it. Even as a typographically aware reader, you wouldn't see it. But it takes the photographing and all the scientific gizmos at our disposal to be able to highlight that, and that is really fascinating.
Yeah, with especially kind of the 21st century technology. I mean, it is perhaps maybe a little bit ironic, like um that the process of punch cutting, like as a craft, is entirely the same now as it was during Baskerville's time. I think our analysis, right, like and the ability to study these materials are benefiting from this incredible technology that we have. But if one were to make type and cast and really to do it well, you would pretty much rely on the exact same standards and the same procedures that Baskerville and the other punch cutters. So it's like it's fascinating that that technology is kind of, I wouldn't say perfect, but it certainly was perfected to the point where it just worked so well for centuries. And even today, certainly you can make some computer aided cutting of type, but to do it well and to kind of like to get the hands
Mm.
the experience, just the sheer years of experience are incredible to be able to pull this off. It's no easy task.
We look at sort of 6 point punches and we think, how the hell did they do that? You
Yeah.
know, without the technology that we have available today. Well, one thing that has been very interesting is amongst the collection of 3,000 odd punches we have in Cambridge, we have some 20th century punches that were cut by Debony and Pennuel to replace some of the missing punches. Comparing the DMP punches under the microscope with the Baskerville punches, Baskervilles are so much cleaner and sharper than the 20th century punches. Why that is, I'm not altogether sure. Partly, I think, Baskerville had the leisure. He was not doing this as a commercial venture. He had the leisure to sit there and get those punches as clean as possible. Debbie and Perna, De Bernie and Penio, of course, are working under commercial constraints and having to get things out quickly, and therefore um, the standard of punch cutting had declined at that point. And we didn't expect that. We really didn't expect that.
There's a couple of questions that trickled in as we were chatting. There's a question in the chat. I'm just gonna pull it from there. Is there any notation? This is a question from Andrew. Is there any notation from Baskerville that talks about the tweaks he made and why? Is there anything in his papers that like describe? It's usually just it's the in the work kind of the tweaks are there and are not.
There's absolutely not. I would love to find something like that, of course, but no, we unfortunately have nothing. We Sebastian Moynihan, who's a typographic historian in Amiens in France, was very interested in a French type punch cutter called Claude Jacob. And in the course of researching Claude Jacob, Sebastian has come across mention of Baskerville's sketchbook for his type. Where is that? You know, if we could only get our hands on that, that would be a fabulous thing to have. Um, Probably doesn't exist anymore, but that
Mhm.
would be a wonderful thing to get our hands on.
Mhm. There's also a question from Susan Smith. I think kind of relates at least. And Susan L. Smith was asking about the. I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. Like the categorization of Baskerville's type as being transitional. That's obviously much later, 20th century description as a label for that kind of period of type between moderns and the Gorals. Um, there's definitely like contention around that. It just seems to me, pejorative may be a little strong of a word, but it definitely puts it into like a strange half space. It's not the old face, Gorals, and it's not quite modern. It's in transition. It makes it seem like it's not completely resolved. Of course, it's resolved. Baskerville made type that he was satisfied with and happy with. I wouldn't say that he would ever imagine it being transitional. I mean, like, do you have a sense of it just kind of always seemed like curious, and I think Susan picks up on that.
Uh, I mean, no, of course he doesn't see his typeface as transitional. How could he? He didn't know what was going to come after and what his typeface was going to inspire. He was certainly looking at I think what Baskerville was partly doing is he was looking at the technology and he understood that you could push the technology available further than other people were doing. He knew the printing press could be made more stable. He knew paper could be made smoother. And then that would enable him to produce a typeface where it is far more contrasty than had gone before. There is an interesting conversation that goes on in the typographic academic world about is Baskerville's or any punch cutter's intent? Do we see their intent in the punch, or do we see their intent on the printed page? I think, and working with Ricardo on this, and the two of us have conversations about this. We both have the sense that what is on the printed page is what Baskerville intended, but he knew to get to what he intended, he then had to create this very contrasty um, punch because he, more than any other punch cutter at that time, was fully aware of all the subsequent processes. And we both feel he made that allowance. So he cuts his punches very finely. And when you see the punches close up, the fine lines are extremely fine. There's no way that he was going to print it like that. But he knew he had to push the extremes that far to be able to end up with what he got on the printed page. But no, I'm not, I'm sure he wouldn't have thought of himself as a bridge or
Mhm.
anything, I don't think.
Yeah. Well, again, it's it just kind of highlights for me like the tension in kind of historic labels, which we need them for clarity. We need them for our time. We need them to sort of help us understand relatively quickly. Okay, moderns are these. This period of type that looks this way is this. Like they're very handy labels that just kind of speak to the tension between like what we in the future kind of think about things from the past and how we need to kind of make sense of them. But contemporaneously, things are obviously seen in a very different light. And again, I think it just feels like it's a very complicated process of trying to group things, and there's certainly many attempts at kind of trying to fix or kind of create alternative systems to the Vox and the type I systems, but it sometimes it just needs something really straightforward that just kind of works. There's a question that came in from Lynn Baggett about the story of the missing E in the last name. I wonder if you could speak to that. It's
Right, tell me
the
the question.
missing E in the slate cut
Oh,
in his last
yeah,
name.
okay. Um, well, I think France and the French, from the time Baskerville was born, were very prominent in his life. He was born in a part of the country which was populated by French Huguenots, which had escaped France, and there were many glass engravers. So, France and the French, his interest in France and the French was there right from the beginning. Um, his father ran a pub, and the pub was called Le Coq. So again, it's another kind of French pretension that is going on. Um, you just, spelling was not stable in the 18th century. It really wasn't stable. And his just experimenting, I think, with adding the E, removing the E. Um, so I think very quickly after that he stabilizes and keeps the E. All the documents you see him sign, he's spelling Baskerville with the last E.
Hmm. And certainly kind of a nice poetic connection to the Conan Doyle's Hound of Baskerville. It's just like, and I think there's a scene that takes place on the street that Baskerville lived, and I think there's some physical connection to the stories as well, which is really funny. My last question to maybe to close this out, given the multi-year nature of this project, and I'm sure there's it was really great to see the faces involved in the project, and I know you mentioned there's more folks behind the scenes working on this. It's obviously like a major undertaking. What would be um, what's the plan in terms of like publishing some of this work, some of this research? What are the ongoing plans to see the fruits of this?
Yes, I mean we publish in academic journals as we go along, and they are all sorts of academic journals. So, metallurgy journals, archaeology journals, heritage science. So discrete papers are coming out as we go through the project. We're certainly doing a piece with iMagazine in London at the beginning of the year. We will do an extended blog, and then we will do a kind of photographic essay for the publication. Certainly, I would love to be able to work on the object biography element of this and to bring in all the other strands that I can only allude to in this talk, to bring them into this really holistic, cohesive biography of the Punches, their life, and their extended life. So yeah, I would love to do that. Ricardo and Mikel Patinet are going to be producing a revival, digital revival, based on all the measurements that we've been taking and the images of the punches themselves. In fact, they're in Lucerne at the moment, working with an MA group on an aspect of that. That should be released. Well, we hope to have a launch for that September next year.
It's fantastic. That's a great thing to look forward to. And there was one question I missed that was in the chat in terms of the ability to view the punches. I presume they're somewhat inaccessible given the scope of the project, but they are publicly accessible.
They are
Is there an
publicly
approach?
accessible by appointment. You would have to register with the university library. And yeah, but yes, anyone can go and take a look at them, that's for sure.
It is a treasure. It's
Oh,
certainly
it's a great treasure.
to be able to see these things and to learn from all of this. Thank you so much, Caroline. I'm really thrilled we can put this talk together that sheds a good lens on this material. I'm so glad that we have this talk. And thank you for coming and spending a great deal of time with us. And good luck with ongoing work. Really looking forward to the fruits of the labor of the stuff that you guys have been so hard at work. So thank you, and thank you for doing that work.
Thank you. It's been great to be here. Thank you.
Take care, everyone.